We're gonna talk about comics from Devil's Due. It's something you wondered if Talking Joe would ever do. I guess we'll explain it all to you. Gonna take some time to read the books we've never read.
Hey, it's me, Mark, and welcome to Talking Joe, the best and longest running dedicated G.I. Joe comics podcast. If you're new to the show, you can find out all of the details over at the website talkingjoe.uk. Today, we are continuing our look at the Disavowed era of G.I. Joe with an interview special with guest Tim Seeley. Now, before we bring him on, let me just introduce my regular co-host. It's Tim Finn.
Hello, Mark, and hello, listeners. Let's bring in our guest right now.
So, without further ado, let's add him in. Tim Seeley is an American comic book creator. Many credits to his name. It includes writing books such as Grayson, Batman Eternal, and co-creating Image Comics titles Hack, Slash, but most importantly, as a creator synonymous with the Devil's Due era of G.I. Joe, most significantly penciling issues 23 to 43, the bulk of them anyway, writing issues of Frontline, Special Missions, the third and fourth Transformers crossovers, and more besides. So here he is. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, what's up? Good to have you. Good to meet you, or whatever.
That's our line. Good to have you.
Right. Sorry, it's early and I've been writing for a long time and my brain is fried, so there you go.
It's good to have you on and talk Devil's Due, really. So maybe a good place to start would be at the beginning. It sounds like you and Josh Blaylock rose up through the ranks together, that you knew each other both from a very early age.
Yeah, so I met Josh at Wizard World Chicago back in the day in a portfolio line. He was standing in front of me, and he was, he was at behind the table of Heroes, Hall of Heroes, a publisher. And I had showed him a comic I was working on, and he had just signed up to do a book there. And I loved the Hall of Heroes stuff. They had Vortex and Cyber Frog and some other stuff. I think I was 18, and then so Josh and I just, he said, "This is cool stuff. We should talk about doing stuff someday." And then this is a bit back before email, so we would just like send each other packets of art and samples and stuff, and talk on the phone. And so we worked on Minotaur together. And then Josh at one point called me. I was in college, so I was like 19 or 20. And he said he was going to try to get the license to G.I. Joe. And we had done a G.I. Joe sticker thing together. I drew a sexy Baroness, and we got a cease and desist from Hasbro. And Josh was like, "Yeah, but now I know who to send to." So we got the pitch going, and then he got the rights to do G.I. Joe. And then I had just interned at Marvel my last year of college. And then ultimately when Josh, decided to start a publishing company and kind of shock the world with the sales of G.I. Joe, he needed help. And I was living in Minneapolis, and I knew how to run an editorial room, I guess, kind of, from having just interned at Marvel. So he had me come down and become a employee. And I started out as a art director, editor, I guess, scheduling guy. And then eventually I became the artist of G.I. Joe and started writing stuff and all that other stuff.
So whenabouts in like the publishing history of G.I. Joe did you actually join Devil's Due?
Pretty much from the beginning to some degree. Issue 1 came out 9/12/01 and like right after 9/11. And then I'd been helping Josh a little bit with stuff, but I was living in Minneapolis. So I was just like, helping him with stuff I knew about setting up editorial stuff, but I didn't work there full time. And then about 7 months later, that March, he had me come down from Minneapolis to work for a week, and really just kind of because, the comic was so successful. And I think so much of like the scheduling and stuff was kind of just a shock to the system for those guys that I'd come down and help them out. I also did some inking on issue 4 or 5, I can't remember, maybe 4, because the editor, the inker was a friend of mine, the artist was a friend of mine. Steve Kurth was a guy I went to high school with, or college, I'm sorry. So it was all people who knew each other. And then I came down that March, and then that following May or June, I moved to Chicago to work on staff. So I think the issue 7 or 8 had just come out, and I started working on issue 10 or 11. And very early on, when I moved down to Chicago, me and Josh and Mike Norton and Chris Crank got together and like basically created a story Bible for what the series was going to be going forward. So, the whole like the Serpentor storyline and all that stuff was sort of a plan that we had made very early on.
Oh wow!
And then kind of it was eventually when Josh stopped writing it, and then Brandon Jerwa took over and stuff. That was all sort of part of our loose plan.
It's interesting. So like a kind of loose plan collaboration that you always all worked on together, rather than sort of Josh completely in isolation, him locked away in a room with a blank piece of paper trying to figure out what he's going to do.
The first 4 for sure were Josh doing all the writing and literally locked away in a room trying above a 7-Eleven in Chicago, trying to both publish a book which was phenomenally successful and wrangle all this. I just remember that those first like few months was just like, holy shit! I know there was going to be this much other stuff than making the comic, and of course, sending stuff to Hasbro and making changes. And one of my first jobs was just going over the art and changing things that Hasbro had said, hey, this doesn't match the toy, or they objected to the content because there was something too sexy or too violent or whatever. So that was like my earliest thing on G.I. Joe, besides like helping plot stuff and mailing stuff to Image and stuff.
You were making art corrections on the boards, or you were making digital corrections or corrections to copies?
This was the days before. I mean, you could kind of do some digital corrections in Photoshop, but mostly we would do it on boards, or we'd do a patch and scan it in. And so there's lots of weird little cover stuff every once in a while where it'll be like, oh, that's a thing we patched in or redrew or whatever. Because Hasbro, I think, wasn't prepared for the book to be successful. And at the time, G.I. Joe was kind of a dead brand. Like, they weren't doing anything with it. So, and then as it got more successful, they got more sort of interested in making sure that it was maintaining something that, that they could turn around and pitch for a new TV show or movie or something. So that was kind of the more successful we got, the more we had to do that kind of stuff.
And you were also asked, right, if you wanted to be the lead artist for the launch. Is that right?
Well, the original, issue 1, Josh asked me if I wanted to draw it, and I mean that's probably right, but I thought I wasn't ready for a monthly comic. I was 24, right? Let me see, 24. I was 24, and I'd just gotten out of college a year before, and I was working at a children's book company full time, and it wasn't like I was kind of just afraid to do that. So I recommended Steve Kurth, who was a guy I had gone to college with, who was an amazing artist and was way farther along, and a little bit older than me. So I knew he was ready to go. So, and then Barb Schultz, the inker, was another person I knew in Minneapolis. So I didn't draw the original stuff, but I definitely hooked up the original creative team with the people Josh knew, because John Larder and the colorist Scott Worley, the editor, those are all people that Josh knew. So we kind of combined our Rolodexes to get that book going.
What did you go to college for? What did Steve Kurth go to college for?
We both have degrees in illustration. So we went to University of Wisconsin Eau Claire, which is in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. It is it's a pretty small school, but they had a decent art program, and also they were okay with, again, this is 1996 or whatever, 97. They were okay with comics, which was not a thing. I mean, other colleges that I applied to wouldn't let you do comics. But Eau Claire, Steve had done it, and then when I went through, I was like, can I major in illustration, but I want to do a focus in comics, and they'd let me do it. And they gave me credit for working at Marvel, and they did all kinds of stuff. So at the time, that was a big coup, because nobody was doing it except for Savannah College of Art and Design. So there was no other real, comics program. So so Steve and I knew each other not through college directly, because he graduated before me, but we were the comic guys in town in Eau Claire, and we would go to house parties and shit. The bar, we were always at the bar together. So it was easy for me to recommend Steve to do the job, because I knew he was an awesome artist.
When you joined, comics is mostly like a freelance kind of industry, really. Most people are freelance, but you joined as staff. So were you getting like a standard monthly paycheck and just absorbing all of the work that was being chucked at you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a crazy system, because, well, one of the things Josh, because there was so much sort of additional stuff. There was making the comic, drawing and writing it, but there was so much other stuff. There was like, designing characters and doing art corrections, putting things together, sending stuff to Image, sending stuff to Hasbro. Like, so he needed people on staff. And because I had done that internship, but and I'd worked at a publishing company, for a year and a half by that point, like he knew I knew the business side of things, or at least the production side. I knew that for sure. So, that he hired me basically as an art director, I think was what I was hired as. Mike Norton was hired as an art director. Chris Crank was like the web guy. And so that was kind of the initial crew along with Josh and Susan. And yeah, we were staff, which was very unusual. I guess, IDW and stuff, they all had graphic designers and stuff like that. So we were kind of like, we were doing publishing company jobs, but we were also drawing comics. So eventually my job became, I was full-time. I think I was making like 40 grand a year. And I was, the full-time artist on G.I. Joe. And then because of the schedule of doing a book that was going to have to go through all those approvals, I had to draw a page and a half a day every day. That was my job. So the reason I don't have any hair now is I had to draw pretty quick, but I learned a ton, and a big part of that process was just that we were kind of like the original Marvel bullpen almost, like the old idea of, having everybody there to do everything together and always communicating, because there's so many moving parts to the early Devil's Due stuff.
What had you done at Marvel? How long were you there? What had you done at the children's book publishing company?
Well, when I was in college, I got an internship at Marvel. So I was an intern in the Spider-Man. I'd applied to be an art intern, but then I didn't get it. And I was like, what the fuck? I didn't get the art internship. And then they called me back and they're like, hey, we think you applied for the wrong thing here. Would you like to apply for an editorial internship? I was like, okay. Because I didn't know exactly what it was. So I applied and they took me for the Spider-Man office. So at the time it was Ralph Macchio and his assistant, Matt. And so then I went there and worked there as an intern for the summer. I realized, oh yeah, because the art internship was just production. It was like taking zip drives and like putting art on them and sending. It was like not what I would have wanted to do. And so the editorial job at Marvel was, collating books and accepting art and calling artists when they were late and talking them off the ledge when they were depressed and meeting with people. It was an amazing internship, but it was also like a really weird time to work at Marvel because they were going through bankruptcy. And in fact, and not because they weren't selling comics, but because of some bad investments and all this other stuff. So one of my jobs sometimes was calling artists and telling them that we were suing them for back pay and shit. So like I saw a lot of stuff that was good about comics and I saw a lot of bad. And I saw like how things can go to shit. So I think that really helped, just sort of have a good sense of what it would be like to actually work in the business.
That was full-time one summer?
Yeah. I worked there for 3 some months, from May to late August. So yeah.
And then what did you do at the children's book publisher?
I was a staff illustrator. So my job was to read manuscripts for educational children's books and some storybooks, and then like do spot illustrations or technical diagrams. I was the this is 1999, 2000. So one of my main jobs was that I was the Photoshop guy. Like they had a staff artist who was traditional, and I would help her with her traditional stuff, scan it, do all that shit. And then I would also just do like tons of illustrations. There's all kinds of books out there that I drew, just tons of them. Because I was drawing like a couple of books every month, probably.
Some of this is educational, or is it like entertainment?
Learner books.
Oh, yeah.
It's a little bit of both. It's in Minneapolis. It's a great company. It was a great job to start out on because they did mostly educational stuff, but they also did storybooks. But I like science, so I got to do science books, which was great, and animal stuff. And I mean, I was a pretty experienced artist before I started there, but after that, I could draw anything because I had to draw just crazy shit, all kinds of stuff. How to dissect a chicken? I did a whole how to dissect a chicken in a science class. I did all kinds of stuff.
And you said a little earlier that when you started on the G.I. Joe book that you're kind of learning as you go along, and you're trying to doing this incredible output, 1.5 pages a day. When I've spoken to artists before, they'll say, "Oh, I can't look at my early work. I just can't stand it. It's horrible." I noticed that in a recent interview, you said that your favorite issue was actually I think the first one you did is it issue 16 or something, the sort of the X-Files style one with them
Spirit
sort
and
of tracking down these spooky children.
yeah.
I wondered, what's your recollection of that issue, and why do you have such a strong kind of feeling towards it, even though it was your first?
There had never really been a conversation about me drawing G.I. Joe. I think there had been, at some point, Josh was like, "Hey, we'll get the license for Voltron or Army of Darkness or Micronauts and stuff," and then it was sort of like, "Oh, those will be the things that I'll throw in to draw one of those." And Mike was talking about drawing Micronauts and stuff, and so that was kind of our approach. We would get ourselves a license that we would be able to draw eventually, but G.I. Joe really wasn't on the platter for me. And a big part of it is I'm not super, like, I loved the toys as a kid, but I always loved the weird stuff. I always liked Cobra Law and the stuff that everybody else hates. That was I loved. But then it kind of came up. It's just timing wise, like Steve was kind of getting burnt out on the schedule, and tonally that we knew this issue was going to be different, and it was going to be kind of a spooky horror kind of thing, sort of. And I was like, that's my thing. And so it's probably the issue of G.I. Joe that matches the most of what I would want to do, kind of, And we got to sort of redesign, Spirit a little bit and do a sort of different thing with him, so he wasn't quite as like stereotypical tropey, and then like bring CoverGirl to the forefront because she hadn't done a lot of stuff, as a character on her own, just drive tanks and stuff. So, but I think it felt like I really understood it finally, and I just had so much fun drawing that issue. And like, I don't know, as the thing is happens as you get older is you start to doubt things more because you know shit. And when I was younger, I didn't know anything, and so I didn't doubt anything. Right? I was just like, this shit's gonna be fucking awesome. People will love it. I don't care. And and I like, which is an attitude I don't have anymore. It's been beaten out of me by working in comics for 20 some years. So it is. I can look at it and just be like, holy shit, I just went nuts. I was just like, oh shit, here's a crazy ass super image 90s influenced take on G.I. Joe, and I didn't care. I just thought it would be cool.
After Steve Kurth sort of dropped off the book, there was a kind of an in and out of various artists. Didn't seem to sort of find a regular artist that could quite stick for more than a few issues, and then you joined around about 23-ish. And then pretty much stayed on the book for 40 to 43, with a couple of fill-ins in between, I think. So like a really long stint. And I think when an artist is on a book for such a long time, it sort of builds up that longevity and that consistency on a book. It's almost like the kind of bigger than the sum of the pieces, because it's an era then, rather than just a piecemeal.
Yeah, and that's the thing you could do back then, and the reason I ended up working on 23, if I remember, was, we were, we're kind of, various artists were coming in, but I think, people were like, I can draw a couple issues, but then Voltron is coming. And then, and we knew the artists that we were working with were going to be busy with other stuff. So, but if I remember the meeting I had with Josh, where he was like, people really liked 16. So, if you want to do it, and, which was, it was like vindicating to some degree that it had worked. And again, I was young and I didn't give a shit, and I just thought, everything was, it'll be great. I'll work it out, and it wasn't jaded or anything. So I just ended up rolling into 23 with Brandon on it, and I think we had a pretty good sense of what it was going to be, and we knew now, like, because I think early on we were working on it, we're like, well, is this direct sequel to the Marvel book? Do things from the cartoon count? And we kind of came to a point where we're like, it all counts. It all counts. And we had a pretty good, which I really liked about it. I thought that was kind of a creative way for us to do it. And, just, we worried about continuity, but we weren't sort of held to it. So we could bring in the Red Shadows. We asked Hasbro, like, what was on the table, and they sort of gave us a list of things. And we're like, well, shit, we're going to bring back the Red Shadows and everything. So it was really fun. It was, and one of my favorite things about that era was, like, we would go to Hasbro and we would, like, go hang out for licensing days and, like, see what they were working on and see toy prototypes. And I mean, it was pretty fun. Hang out with Larry. That was awesome. That was my favorite part of the job, I think, was we got to hang out with Larry, and he's an idol of mine and one of the best dudes in the biz. And so all those things were, it was just such a perfect first gig, if that is what it was for me.
And you opened the door on your encounter with meeting Larry. So I think there's a story then that has to be told.
Yeah, have I told it before? I'm sure I've told it before. Well, because Larry and I were, we would always end up at these Joe conventions together, and then if we were at some kind of convention, Larry was kind of like, and you know him. He's kind of a you know, I think he's growing into it, but at the time he was kind of like, you know, I did G.I. Joe. It was a job. I had a good time. It was cool, and you know, it's kind of like that thing that Gene Roddenberry would say. He was like, I created Star Trek, but I don't have Star Trek sheets, you know. And how Larry was with G.I. Joe, and so like when we would go to conventions, it would always be like do some, you know, panel or signing, and then Larry would be like, hey, let's go get a beer. And so he was just like a cool guy. We could talk about music and shit. Like we just had a good time hanging out. And I really looked up to him because he was a guy who wrote and drew, which was something I wanted to do. And there wasn't a ton of people in comics that wrote and drew, you know, with like the longevity of Larry Hama. So, but yeah, we ended up at a con one time. And it was Hasbro was there, and it was in Disney World in Florida, and Hasbro took us to Pleasure Island, which was, or Treasure Island. I can't remember what it's called. Pleasure Island. It's the adult Disney resort.
You mean for grown-ups and
Right.
Parents?
Yeah,
Okay.
right. Not adult like 30, but adult. You know, it was me and Larry and like Dwight Stahl and all these people from Hasbro and Sam Wells, and man, we just had way too much fun. I mean, I have just flashes of that night. It's like I remember us chasing giant people with on stilts, and I remember us jumping in the fountain. Like, just I don't know what the fuck we were doing. We were having a good time. But on the way back, we were driving. You know, we had a cab pick us up. It was me and Larry and Sam in the front. No, Sam had gone home earlier. It was just me and Larry. And so we're going through the resort, the back side of the resort, like past Epcot and stuff in a cab. And I was like not doing well. And I was like, you got to pull over the cab. And so Larry's like trying to get me out of the cab, and he opens the car, and I just puke right on his shoes, right there, right, just barfed on his shoes. And then, you know, he's trying to help me up and stuff. And then the sprinklers turned on. We were in like some business park in their backyard. I just barfed there. And then the sprinklers turned on because it was 5 a.m. So, you know, classic me, real impressive. Then we got back to the hotel, and I woke up the next morning. I'm so hungover, and Josh was so mad. He's like, oh my God, you guys got so crazy drunk. Sam was super sick. And he's like, yeah, so crazy drunk. Hasbro's going to be so mad at us. And then we met them in the morning. They're like, hey. So it was all good. And every time I see Larry, he moves it out of the way so I don't really see it.
Yeah.
Jumping around a little bit, what was your first exposure to G.I. Joe as a kid? Older siblings, neighbors? Did you know of G.I. Joe? Like, had it existed before you got into it? The cartoon, the toy, the comic, like 70s G.I. Joe?
I didn't know 70s G.I. Joe, but I did. You know, I grew up in the 80s in the country. And so our big joy was going to Shopko or Kmart, and my grandma would buy us a toy. So my brother Steve and I were the He-Man, Thundercats guys. My brother Brad was the G.I. Joe guy. And so he was always getting the G.I. Joe stuff. And then we didn't have cable or anything, and we didn't have, you know, WGN or whatever. So we didn't see the cartoon until later. But because my brother was getting the toys, sometimes we would get the Marvel comics. So I started reading the Marvel comic around the Cobra Civil War, I think. Yeah, somewhere around there. Maybe before that. I definitely had the issue with the Mike Zeck cover with Snake Eyes and Flint and Lady J on it. Like I definitely was reading that stuff then. And I had a few figures, but I wasn't like a hardcore G.I. Joe toy guy. But then later I saw the cartoon, I think in like when it was in repeats, I think I saw it, but it was never like the main thing for me. But I did really like the comic. I think I read it all the way from that issue that I started in the Cobra Civil War up until the Joe Transformers crossovers, which I was obsessed with. Like, so the miniseries and the one where Megatron started appearing in the book, that was all the way up my alley. Andrew Wildman stuff I was super into. So for me, it was mostly a comic book that I was a fan of. And then I had like some figures. Like to this day, I still have my Alley Viper. It's actually on my wall back there. And I still have some of the figures. But there was, you know, I love Cobra Law. I saw the G.I. Joe movie when it came out. You know, like when they added horror elements to G.I. Joe, I was all in.
Where did you get your comics as a kid?
Well, we had a grocery store called 29 Super in Schofield, Wisconsin, and it had a giant comic rack. So my mom would take us grocery shopping, and she would just drop us off at the rack, and then we would just look through comics and Heavy Metal magazine and stuff, and and pick out comics. And then we also had a Walgreens, a Walden Books. I mean, we had a Walden Books as well. And then eventually we got a comic book store. Not until 1989 we got a comic book store in my town called Gateway Comics and Games, and that was a big one for me. We would go every Friday. My mom would take us to town and drop us off. New Comic Day was on Friday back then, and that was so. I mean, I was a huge comic book guy, not necessarily like very specific to genres or anything, but that was like a big part of it, you know. And so, if I recall, definitely there's that one issue of G.I. Joe with Serpentor on the cover, and he's got Baroness over the top of his tank.
Mm-hmm.
I bought that off the rack at a Quick Trip in Schofield, Wisconsin, in 1988 or whatever it was.
So we were talking a bit about that sort of the long run that you're having as the artist on the book, and so you know, Brandon Joe is making his mark as the writer, but then as it's wrapping up, he's, you know, having to tweak what, you know, his vision of the story to kind of wrap it up ready for the America's elite. What was that kind of experience like from your lens as the artist, and concluding your run with issue 43 sort of being replaced by a new artist?
I mean, I was glad of it at the time, and I suggested Stefano for America's Elite because he was my collaborator on Hack Slash, and to this day he's one of my closest friends. So,
and did you discover him?
Not really, because he had done something with, I think Scott Worley kind of was the first guy to bring him in, because he brought him in for Micronauts, and then he and Stefano and I started meeting each other at conventions and stuff, and so we were always like, we would talk about horror movies all the time. So when I came up with Hack Slash, he was the first guy I asked, and mostly it was just, you know, pre sort of Zooms and shit like this. So we would just talk on email or instant message and stuff and talk about horror movies. So I don't think I discovered him, but I was a big champion of him. I pushed him for America's Elite, and, you know, obviously he and I did Hack Slash together and still do Hack Slash together 20 years later. But yeah, I mean, at the time I definitely knew I was ready to be done with G.I. Joe, because I'd done 20 issues and I really enjoyed it, but I also kind of felt like, you know, the sort of more military aspects of it were not really my thing. And certainly like drawing airplanes, I was like, I don't want to fucking do this anymore. So I was cool with, you know, having a good run and being happy with it. And, you know, we definitely, Brandon and I think we felt like we had done what we came there to do. And we were going to work with Brandon on other stuff anyway. So we were kind of not too worried about it. But yeah, I mean, I think I suggested Joe Casey initially as well. So, you know, he was a guy I was friends with, and Josh had met him, I think, at a con, and we were like, yeah, we got to get Joe on this. And so we were excited about it. I don't think it was I don't remember ever being like, oh, bummer, you know. And I was like, this is rad. This would be really interesting.
Do you feel like Brandon Jerwa's final storyline was truncated, or that he was pushed out early?
I don't remember. Maybe. I mean, I don't remember us ever having bad blood about it, but I definitely remember we needed to do something, I think, sales-wise. And we knew, if I remember correctly, and again, this is so long ago, but we knew, like, you know, IDW was sniffing around, and we knew that in part because of what we had done, that G.I. Joe was worth a lot more, right? Like, it was suddenly had gone up in value, in part because our comics were really successful. And so, you know, we knew we had to sort of juice it up. We had to make it, people get them talking again, which is an unfortunate reality of ongoing comics, is that you always have to do that. And so, you know, that was a way we'd figured out. It was a way to do it. We could change kind of the way that we did the book. It could be, you know, smaller cast. I think we kind of felt like the bigger cast, though, was great for the hardcore fans, wasn't as appealing to like the more casual fans who were like, I don't know who the fuck Outback is. I don't care. Give me Duke and, you know, Scarlet or whatever. Yeah. So, but I just remember us thinking like, okay, this is what we have to do, and we'll figure out a way to keep everybody working on stuff. But, you know, I mean, and part of that always is when you're working on stuff that isn't yours, that inherently there's things that you wouldn't have done, right? You're working with, you know, and Hasbro was always pretty easy to work with, and I don't really have any complaints working with them whatsoever. But of course they had a plan. They're like, oh, we're going to do this line of toys, and we're going to do America's. No, what was the one? Not America's Elite. They were doing a new toy line. I can't remember what it was called. Sigma Six. Sigma Six. And they were changing their focus a little bit. They were moving away from the 3 3/4. They were doing those bigger figures. So, change or die in this business. So I think, I hope Brandon felt like he got to do a lot of what he wanted to do, but I'm sure there's things that we, didn't get to do.
And you said change or die there, and that's a good segue because as your career kind of pivoted from being mostly an artist to mostly a writer. So maybe if you could talk about that, but before we quite get to that, we've just been talking about G.I. Joe versus Transformers 2, which you drew, and we spoke to EJ Sue about that a little bit as well, and a really interesting collaborative project. One of the comments from like the interviews at the time was that Dan Jolly said that you had a brilliant storytelling idea, which meant they had to sort of radically change one of the plot points for Transformers versus G.I. Joe 2. So obviously, even then, you kind of got storytelling chops, and you're thinking about the story and not just the art component. Do you remember what it was that you suggested?
This is the time travel one.
Yeah, I know. I remember drawing that. When I was drawing the G.I. Joes, EJ was drawing the Transformers. I don't know. I don't remember. I mean, I remember the cool thing about that one, and Dan is an awesome writer, and I mean, one of the best I've worked with. I remember he was really open to things that were visual ideas, because he would just be like, I don't know, I got to write the dialogue and come up with a plot, but if you got something cool to draw, just do it. So I don't remember I don't remember. I know we talked a lot about like, if we're going to do time travel stuff, we got to do like a 1930s gangster Transformers. And at the time, none of that stuff, that was the first time it had been done. So did I add the time travel to the future one? I did. I added the let's go to the future and see that's right. Okay, there we go.
I thought it might be.
Yeah.
That future one is a bit of a horror element.
Yeah, that might be the one. But Dan is a horror writer, so I'm pretty sure, wasn't it that we were going to have, they were making Energon out of people? I think that might have been I don't remember. It was a long time ago. But I remember we threw around some weird ass ideas that like the Transformers were eating people, like turning them into, like draining their blood and turning them into Energon and stuff. I don't remember.
I want to redirect you to the other half of Mark's question, and then I want to ask about the next two G.I. Joe Transformers crossovers. But can you talk about being a writer and making this? And this might be a sort of a more recent question than your life at Devils do. But can you talk about changing a focus to more writing and less drawing?
Well, I don't know if it was ever changed the focus, because the first thing I ever did for Devils Do was Love Bunny and Mr. Hell, which I wrote and drew. But one of the things I learned at Marvel, working as intern, I was always really afraid to write anything. I thought I wasn't quite like ready to do it. So when I was at Marvel, I met this guy named Brendan Hay, who did a lot of stuff for Devils Do as well. But he was a writer, like a writer. Like he would write a screenplay in a weekend. He was that kind of guy. And he went on to, work at The Daily Show and did all kind. He now works on the Gremlins TV show, animation show. So he was like a real writer. And so, I started just collaborating with like people I consider real writers. And so that was really educational for me, because I saw like how someone turns something into a script. But what it led to ultimately was that I got really more comfortable with scripts. I'd never seen a script before in my life. And so Brendan really helped me sort of understand that was something I could do. And then I wrote that Love Bunny book and I drew it. And so it was always something in my head I kind of knew how to do. When I started working on G.I. Joe stuff, like, we come up with a Frontline story, and Mike and I wanted to do this thing, and Mike had an idea about doing, cooking with Roadblock. And so, we came up with that story, and I ended up typing it out, and I was like, hey, that was kind of fun and kind of easy. And so while I was working on G.I. Joe, whenever I had frustrations with like, oh, you can't draw that, I'd be like, I'll write it down, And then I decided I was going to make a comic of which I put all the stuff I couldn't do. And that became Hack Slash, which I wrote. Originally, I was going to draw it. Robert Kirkman was going to write it. And then he got busy and he ended up, Walking Dead took off. So I was like, I'll just write it. And then I was still drawing G.I. Joe, so I couldn't draw it. And I gave it to Stefano. So I'd been writing anyway. I just didn't, a big part of it was just a level of confidence. And then once I had stuff out, once I saw a book I wrote on the stands, it was just like, well, I can just keep doing this. So it's always been kind of part of what I do, but it didn't pay the bills until, probably 12 years ago. So, and I think part of it talking to Larry really helped, because Larry was always just kind of like, when you're drawing, you're writing it anyway. So why not?
Interesting.
You know.
Okay, so the final page of G.I. Joe Transformers 2 has Cobra Law. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, they're not in the third crossover, but they are in the fourth crossover. And the fourth crossover is 2 double-sized issues, has Cobra Law. Can you talk about your approach to 3 and 4 now that the crossover was your territory?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember because it was a long time ago. But I remember we had artists that we knew we could work with that were going to be really good Transformers artists, which was the hardest thing to do, is find people who could draw Transformers. And we knew we wanted to do something big and crazy, because the one that IDW had done, or Dreamwave, sorry.
Yeah, the World War II one.
Right.
Some bonkers.
And so we were kind of competing with them, because they would do their own thing, and we were trying to stand out from them. And so, but we started like competing with them, trying to do something different. And so we decided, let's just go bigger and crazier. And so the idea for the third one was like, I pitched it to Josh, was what if Serpentor was made out of Megatron and other Transformers? Like, instead of being Julius Caesar or whatever, he's got Megatron. And so we used a part of the third one, because originally the cameo that we had in 2 of Cobra Law was like just a joke, because Hasbro's like, you don't use them. They're are sort of ashamed of them. We don't want to use them. So it's just like a joke. But then the third one, like, I don't know, it was fun and goofy and big, and it gave them lots of new toys to play with, right? Because there was, a Serpentor that transformed into a jet or whatever. So the fourth one then was like, Seeley, just do whatever the hell you want. And I was like, I'm bringing back Joe Colton, and I'm doing the Yeti playset, and I'm doing Cobra Law, and also Cobra Law works for Unicron. I was like, just went crazy. Just,
In Andrew Wildman, you have someone who can definitely draw both.
Right. Yes. And then the pitch was, hey, we can get Andrew Wildman. As a kid, of course, I loved Andrew Wildman stuff. So I was like, yes, I'm going to write this for Andrew to go crazy on. And I don't know, like, fans don't always respond as well to stuff where you're just like, here's a ton of crazy ideas, let's have fun. They don't always respond to it that well, because I think sometimes they think you're not taking the thing they love seriously. But to me, that is the point, right? Like, these are a bunch of toys and you're just mashing them together like you're a kid. So that was always the appeal to me. And, the idea that essentially the Earth was seeded for Unicron's coming, and that Cobra Law was kind of the caretakers, like that's fun as shit. And it was also kind of based on the original book, the Horizon, the one that introduced Shangri-La, and all that stuff, which was what Cobra Law was based on anyway.
Lost Horizon?
Yeah, Lost Horizon. And then plus, that's why we call it Black Horizon. And then, of course, like the Cthulhu, the Lovecraftian elements. So it's just like a nerdy horror kid getting to do the stuff that, was implied but not explicit in those creations. I mean, definitely Unicron is basically Lovecraft Transformers, and definitely Cobra Law is the same thing. It's the cult, it's the people becoming fish dudes. It's that sort of kind of horror stuff anyway.
You mentioned as well that sort of you're friends with Robert Kirkman and worked on stuff, and the industry rumor at the moment is that he might have some involvement in G.I. Joe in the future. And so I wondered if you could sort of touch on your experience of working with Robert on G.I. Joe in the past.
Yeah, I have a couple stories about it. One, when we were trying to figure out other things to do with G.I. Joe, and that was around the time that we were doing the Frontline. We were trying to think of other series we could do with G.I. Joe. And I was friends with Robert, and he and I talked about doing something together. And again, he was originally going to write Hack Slash, and then I got him to pitch us a Snake Eye series, and it was like a just pure action. I was going to draw it, and I remember there was like a crazy scene. There's like tons of crazy scenes, and there was like a Snake Eyes fight on the moon, and we loved it. Josh and I thought it was great. And I remember we sent it to Hasbro, and they said something about you can't put Snake Eyes on the moon. And I just remember Robert being like, "Oh, what's so hard about this? The Snake Eyes on the moon. It's easy." So it's like, but so they didn't take it, and I remember that being like a big bummer. And then, but I had known Robert from cons way back when we were in our early 20s. I think he might have been 19 when I met him. I think, and I know he loves this shit. So I don't have any special insider information on whether it goes to Skybound, though I suspect it probably does. But he loves this stuff. I was at a con, I think San Diego one time, and I was walking around and I saw him shopping for Transformers. We used to talk about He-Man guys all the time. I was with him I was with Cena Grace at a convention one time in Arizona, and we found this, I think it was a Centurion or something. I can't remember what it was. But I remember Cena call Robert and be like, "Hey, do you need this one?" And so he bought it for him and sent it in the mail. So he is ahead. He has been into this stuff as long as I have known him, and many years before that. So I would say he's probably a great curator for this stuff. If the rumors are true, and again, I don't have any special information, but it makes sense.
Can you talk about 2007 and Devil's Due wrapping up its relationship with Hasbro and G.I. Joe? When we interviewed Josh Blaylock, he described a lot of fatigue, that it had been a real grind for those years with approvals, and despite really good sales, a sense that Hasbro didn't fully believe in or understand G.I. Joe or what Devil's Due was doing. How did it, and then IDW gets it, right?
Yeah.
So can you talk about 2007 and sort of it wrapping up?
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember everything about it, but I do remember, like, there was a sense that most of the people at Hasbro liked us fine and were happy to work with us and liked what we were doing. But there were some people that felt like we duped them because, it was a small studio run by just, a couple people. And so I remember it might have been specifically just one guy that did not like us. And as it went on, he just made things harder for us. I mean, like, just started putting things in our way. And making the approvals harder, and it was like a forced attrition. Like, we will make them run away.
Perhaps one person or very, very few people at Hasbro were making things hard for you, and your sense of 2007 was.
Well, I mean, and I think so. There was kind of two things going on with that. There was that, and then there was also that they knew all of a sudden G.I. Joe was worth more because of they were getting a movie and stuff. But it was, it was like I think they didn't want to sort of be associated with this scrappy little company if they could do something more, like, I don't know, classy, or I don't know, more prestige,
or big.
So, I remember we were really bummed about it, and it really kind of, it put a big stop in most of our plans. And, I think by 2007, I was kind of already working on some Marvel stuff and such anyway, but it certainly like slowed down any kind of plan we had to expand. And, it was a bummer, but, we knew going in, like, you're licensing something. And part of this is we knew we had to make our own things to keep people coming to Devil's Due because we didn't own G.I. Joe. So that's why I did Hack Slash. Like, I knew I needed my own thing. And that's why Josh was doing Mercy. And that's why, we were working on stuff knowing that this was a possibility. I think IDW is probably going through it now. So it all comes full circle. And I love those guys. It's not like we're all like, to hell with you guys. Like, we knew those guys. We knew Chris and all those guys at IDW, and we were friends with everybody. So, it's just the nature of the game. Would I have preferred to work on staff at a company and have health insurance and all that stuff? Yes, I would have preferred that. But I have been a freelancer now for 18 years. So this is just the way it is.
When G.I. Joe left Devil's Due, did Devil's Due downsize and you stopped being staff?
We downsized, but I didn't stop being staff. We just had less, like, we would do stuff on the side. I was still there for another year or two, I think, a year, I think. But I was kind of working, like, helping out. We were doing, a couple of, like, the finishing up the Dungeons and Dragons stuff and whatever. But, we did downsize. We did get a new space. And then I kind of I would do stuff like for Devil's Due, I was still doing hack slash, but I was also drawing for Marvel. I was drawing Exiles at the time, I think. You know, I had to go freelance. Like there wasn't enough stuff. So I think I don't remember exactly when, but I remember we decided that I wouldn't be staff anymore. I would just be a contractor. And I know I definitely had to go through some tax shit because of that. Because I stopped being a contractor.
That's what everyone
To a
wants.
freelancer, and that was a whole bunch of shit. But yeah, and it was just like, fortunately, I knew people, I knew enough people in the business. Devil's Due was still publishing hack slash for a couple more years until we went to Image. But not having GI Joe and not having that main lifeline and not having sort of come up with enough of our own stuff that hit was kind of too much for the company to continue at the size that it was. Obviously, Devil's Due is still going to this day, but just in a much different capacity because it wasn't a sustainable way to do anything without those licenses, And IDW, fortunately, is going to have a bunch of stuff to cushion them. They've got other stuff. They've got Ninja Turtles and stuff. They're going to be fine, but it's tough. That having now published hack slash at Image for what, 13 years, 14 years, 13 years. Like I know it's tough. I know what it's like to publish your own stuff and try to have it hit. It's pretty tough.
I was just going to share what you drew for me the last time we saw each other.
Oh, yeah.
In London, 2013.
Solid sketch. Not bad, Tim.
That's great.
That's in the front of my G.I. Joe bind there. Great Cobra Commander.
Mark has bound his issues of G.I. Joe.
Very cool. What's funny that they call it Disavowed, which is now also what the IDW stuff will be. So you're all disavowed.
They'll need a new name for it, yeah.
I wanted to go back to sort of the beginning. When we interviewed Blaylock, he said that so he had done Penguin Brothers for he had self-published Penguin Brothers through Labyrinth Studios, and he said that then he did Minotaur, and he said that you had redrawn it. And then I got a follow-up where he said you redrew one issue. Our idea was to pitch it for a larger publishing deal.
Image, yeah.
Okay, so just so I can get, because this is so, the sort of to know that two guys at the beginning before they sort of hit it big are doing this scrappy stuff. I feel like it's like Eastman and Laird in 1983 before that first convention with Ninja Turtles 1. All right, so
sure, yeah, less money.
So the two of you decided that you redrew an entire comic that he'd already drawn?
Sort of. So he had Minotaur, which he had self-published. And then, Josh's style, I think he's more comfortable with more cartoony stuff. And, Penguin Brothers and such and Mercy eventually. So I'd done like a more realistic take on it, like more, I don't know, 90s image-ish, which is kind of how I draw. And he liked it, and so then he did a version of Minotaur, like a sort of rewrite of the first issue, where we were going to take that to Image, and we sent it to Jim Valentino. I remember it was like a big deal to me that Jim Valentino was seeing my stuff, and then I remember we got a pretty good response, but I don't think they took it. Or maybe I can't remember exactly how that went. But we kept kind of plugging away at stuff, and that's how we ended up eventually at G.I. Joe. And then we took that remake of Minotaur and we turned it into Core, which is a book that we published at Image that I drew and Josh wrote, which is it was kind of a reshuffle of Minotaur. We couldn't call him Minotaur because Top Cow at the time had a label called Minotaur Press. So we had to rename him, and so he went from the Minotaur to the Manicore, and we just called it Core, and that's how that all happened.
Okay, and just so that I can get this sentence right, you did draw that first issue of that updated Minotaur.
I did, yes. I have it here somewhere.
Okay. Mark, let me pass the mic back to you for our extra minutes.
What's interesting, sort of reading around the Devil's Due, really, is just the sort of that period is that sense of it being a bullpen of who everyone being there and sort of pulling together in one direction. Like, just can you maybe just reflect a little bit on sort of that, what that environment was like, sort of in that sort of G.I. Joe heyday of Devil's Due?
I mean, it was the most fun part of my career. To this day, I can't beat. I would come in at 8:30 in the morning. I would work with Mike and Josh and Sam and Sean and Susan, and we would just, and Marshall and Crank and all those guys. My brother worked there for a while. It was just so much fun. We were always jamming. We were always coming up with shit. I mean, I remember one of the most fun we ever had was we bought a bunch of airsoft guns, and we had a giant war in this in the building that we had. And just we were. It was the coolest thing. It was like the thing that I would always wanted when I was a kid is I would read these Wizard interviews, and they would go to Extreme Studios, and it'd be Rob and Dan Fraga and Morant Michaels and all these guys jamming, or Gaijin Studios where it was like Jason Pearson and Cully Hamner and Brian Stelfreeze, and just the idea of like all the people sitting around making shit together and like going for beers and like get invited to cool parties and shit. Like I was like, that's what I always wanted, and that's what Devil's Due was. Like we that first year we did, I think 14 conventions or something. We would travel every weekend. We were young. I was in my early 20s. Like we were on top of the world. It was a blast. It was also like the comics industry is not built for you to have that much fun. It is not built for you to enjoy your job that much. It is built to be a grind, and it's built to make you a freelancer and alone. And that sucks. And I don't. It's really sad that I doubt anybody else will get to have that kind of experience in comics like we had. I mean, I'm sure the dudes making like NFTs or some bullshit are having a really good time, but
I don't know. I think they're all working remotely.
Probably, yeah. But it's just it was a particular time. Energy was so much, so positive, and we could argue, and we were always kind of come out on the other side like with some kind of understanding, which is not something I can say happens after working at Devil's Due. So, it was a blast. And I'm always grateful to Josh. I always tell him, thank you so much for that. I'm always grateful to Hasbro for giving us that opportunity, which is why I don't have any sort of ill will that we lost the license. Like we had this amazing moment, and I'm still I work on Masters of the Universe now all the time. So like that 80s toy stuff has always been part of my creative DNA. And it's, I can give it all those things. I have to give all the credit to those 5 years that I worked at Devil's Due. Hack Slash comes from there. So yeah, it was awesome. And I really wish it could be done again. I wish that was something that the comics industry supported, but it doesn't.
We've not spoken too much about like specific like art styles and process. You sort of mentioned a few times like being really enthused by the image style, and would it be fair to say, I guess, that your approach would be like you wanted to make comics or draw comics that would look like your favorite exciting image comics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always kind of my sort of thing. But I mean, I'm not a superhero guy, right? Like I mean, I am, but I'm not just a superhero guy. So I think like that part of comics has not ever been the sort of the driving force for me to make them. But when I sit down to draw something, what I grew up on comes back out to some degree. So, I'm working on this book, Local Man, right now, which is, a book I'm writing and drawing with Tony Fleeks. And so he does the stuff that's set in the modern day and looks kind of crime noir, kind of Sean Phillipsy. And then the side that's, the crazy 90s superhero thing is me. And because when I sit down to do something, that's what comes out of my head easily, despite me not being, exclusively a superhero guy. So, it's, I think you don't have much of a choice, but what your style is sort of it's a amalgamation of things that you are and things that you like and things that struck you, and you have to have fun when you're drawing. So you tend to put the things out that you had fun viewing. Right. So, there's all kinds of little things in there, and I think I'm better now, but I don't think I've changed that much as an artist. I still like sexy ladies and scary monsters and dumb Jack Kirby shit. And I'm the same as I've always been.
And you had some like art assists on like the backgrounds and stuff like that. Is that just time, or is it also that's not the fun stuff to draw? It's the people and the poses and stuff that's more enjoyable.
I mean, that's part of it, but it wasn't the reason. It was always time. And it was always like when we were doing, we had to do things so fast, and part of it was just to justify my paycheck, right? And it's like, you're working in a comic studio, I'm making, whatever, 40 grand a year or something. It's like, okay, well, what does that translate to? How many pages a week? Right. And so and it became easier. Jason Millay would come in and do some background stuff and help me out, and that way we could get 2 books out a month, right? Like I could draw G.I. Joe and I could do an issue of Dungeons and Dragons, and so much of it was just like, that's how studios used to work. I mean, Will Eisner's studio back in the 40s, that's how it worked. Some people would draw backgrounds for the bullpen at Marvel. That's how it would work. So it was very old school in its way, but it was also just like a necessity, because we knew, hey, it's going to take 2 weeks to get this approved by Hasbro, so we better build in some time and get this book done in a week or 2 weeks. So it was just always like us responding to whatever we had to do to get a G.I. Joe or Transformers comic, or just how do we get it out? Okay, here's how we do it.
And did you have a particular tool or technique to achieve that? Did you have like a box of G.I. Joe figures on your desk, for example, that you'd pose as part of your drawing process?
No, but I did have a lot of vehicles. The figures I always used, we had the Marvel handbooks, I think. We were using those, and then we were like, well, let's make one for ourselves, and then also we'll sell it. And we had done those Order of Battle books, I think, that we had done. What were our called? Strike Files? Battle Zone? I don't remember. Something like that.
Yeah. Battle Files, was it?
Battle Files. So we made those for ourselves because we were using the Marvel ones, and then...
And Marvel sort of made Order of Battle for the artists, sort of, and then to sell.
Yep, exactly. So we were doing the same thing. But the vehicles I definitely had to have around, because, as many as I remember I had an Air Striker on my desk, and I had, what else did I have? Just like the stuff that we would do a lot of sort of angles on and just need to draw pretty accurate, because they weren't meant to look like real planes all the time. Like some of them did, but we weren't really allowed to use like always real planes. So we had to kind of just, the toys are kind of amalgamations in there. So, we were always sort of aware that it had to be the toy more than it had to be anything, and sort of realistic. But I will say one thing about drawing G.I. Joe is, once you start drawing a superhero book, you're like, holy shit, this is so much easier. They have tights on, and they don't have tons of folds and fucking backpacks and webbing and all that shit. And guns, God, after that was one of the things, like, by the time I was done drawing, I was like, if I don't draw a gun for a while, I'm good. I hate drawing guns, especially realistic guns. Like, if I never have to draw a fucking M16 again, I'll be happy. So, that was a big part of that drawing G.I. Joe. That is not a part of drawing, Exiles or Spider-Man or whatever.
Excellent. We'll just give you an opportunity to shout out where people can find you, and if there's anything that you want people to check out right now.
Sure. You can find me on Instagram, Tim Seeley, and you can find me on Twitter at Hackin' Tim Seeley, in reference to that /book I've been doing so long. Let's see, the orders for my book Local Man are due on Monday, so if you haven't, the 30th of January, if you want to check that book out, I'm really proud of it. It's kind of a combination of everything I like in one place. It's horror, it's crime, noir, it's superheroes, 90s superheroes. And that's from Image Comics. And I have Money Shot, which is the Scientists as Porn Stars comic I do. And I have West of Sundown, which is Universal Monsters in the Old West. And let's see what else I got. All kinds of good stuff. Vampire book I'm doing at Marvel called The Unforgiven comes out this month. So February, March, April, I have tons of shit out. Tons.
Wow. Sounds like you are being kept very busy.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be a little specific here, because I'm looking forward to Local Man issue #1. Tim, I own a comic book store, and listeners and viewers, issue 1 is out February 22nd.
Yeah.
And Tim, I'll take my journalist podcaster hat off for a second. I very much enjoyed reading the Devil's Due issues and talking to Mark for the podcast. I was not reading them at the time because I was a G.I. Joe fan who was more protective of the Marvel run.
Sure.
But putting on my retailer hat, 6 months ago, we turned a stack of Money Shot Volume 1 face out in the alternative section, and right next to it, Spine Out, are Volumes 2 and 3. And it's just been selling.
Oh, great.
We don't have to say anything.
That's titties and butts and wieners.
So I haven't read all the way through, but what I've read I liked. So as a reader, but particularly as a retailer, thank you.
Oh yeah, anytime. Hey, we got a new series of it coming out. I think it's the funniest one yet. So I'm very happy with it. That's the kind of comic I like to make. So, happy to have people check it out.
Excellent stuff. So I think we'll wrap up. Tim, where Tim Finn now. Where can people find you when you're not talking to me and other comics creators?
Video essays on TV and film at our YouTube page, Atomic Abe. My brick and mortar comic book store is in Somerville, Massachusetts, Hub Comics, and I write about G.I. Joe at arealamericanbook.com.
And you can find out more about Talking Joe, our podcast, and all the links to things that we do over at talkingjoe.co.uk. So I think that just leaves us to say thank you very much to Tim Seeley for taking the time to talk to us and explore 20 years past over at Devil's
Hey,
Due.
you asked me about my office when we first checked in.
Yeah. Let's do.
Oh yeah.
Let's have a little look.
Can you point to the 5 coolest things behind you or around you?
There's a Jenny Frizen revival print right there. You got a Sweet Money Shop poster right there. Let's see. I've got a Biotron right there from Micronauts. And then right here, I have a Mexican knockoff Freddy He-Man, which is pretty sweet for my brother. And then let's see, down here, I've got all of the Remco Mighty Crusaders figures in that shelf right behind me, including among those also the Remco Warlord figure. So there you go.
And a spinner rack over your right shoulder, is it?
Right there is the spinner rack full of a bunch of my comics and also favorite stuff. This is my favorite stuff wall. There's also a bunch of mine up there. There's Money Shot. There's Crow Hack Slash. A whole bunch of stuff.
One last quick question. Where and what do you teach?
I teach at Columbia College Chicago. Here in Chicago, I teach cartooning, comics, and then I also teach concept art for the illustration department.
Does all of the time in the classroom and interacting with students and the department leave any time to write and draw comics?
It has to, unfortunately. Last semester I did 2 full-time jobs. I had a full-time teaching job. I did 4 classes. I had full-time writing and drawing. I worked 80 hours a week. I do not recommend it. I did it for 15 weeks. I thought I was going to die. So right now I'm just doing 2 classes, and I'm working on lots of comics, but also a movie and a children's book. So I'm keeping busy, but the schedule is slightly less death-inducing.
This children's book is assuredly like Lil Hack Slash or Hack Slash Babies.
Yeah, a YA book, I guess is.
Okay. Tim Seeley, thank you so much for joining us. What a pleasure to have you on our podcast.
Thanks so much, guys. Sorry it took me a little bit. I appreciate it.
And Tim Finn, you're going to have to sing. And Tim Seeley, you're welcome to join in. So as
this is a take on I think it's the 1988 television commercial jingle, but with the lyrics slightly changed. Nobody be talking Joe, an international podcast.
Very nice.
There we go. I couldn't let you off the hook, Tim. Latest.
Thanks, guys.